Blindness is a topic in our house, so we have a bit of difficulty in dealing with miracles about blindness, and that's what today's reading is about. So we're challenged when miracles don't happen in the way you expect them to. I hope I can touch on this topic sensitively. Would it be possible to sensitively touch on this topic? How often have you heard someone say, "Did you see that?" Or, "Can't you see that? Can't you understand?" Or, "You must remember that." Don't ask me questions while I'm talking on this video, because I haven't got my hearing aids on. A reading from Mark chapter 8 to introduce the sequence of events. Our reading is from chapter 10. It's called The Yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them on the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." They discussed this with one another and said, "It's because we have no bread?" Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. And he said to them, "Do you still not understand?" I think there's a sermon in itself there about that reading, but I want to concentrate on some words that occur in that reading. The reading set for today is the story of Bartimaeus, who was healed of his blindness, and it's a gem of a story, but it's set in a diamond mine full of gems. We can regard this part of Mark's Gospel as having 2 bookends. The first comes after the story, which has the title in my Bible, The Yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. Each is a story of a blind man, and every incident in between teaches us something towards answering Jesus' question, "Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember?" Maybe it might be time to get out your Bibles or look online and do what I did and use the headings for the stories and the interactions in the stories themselves in chapters 8 to 10 of Mark. Anyway, let's go to chapter 8 of Mark and the bookend at the front, the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida. I'm reading it. "They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, 'Do you see anything?' He looked up and said, 'I see people. They look like trees walking around.' Once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, 'Don't even go into the village.'" Very interesting reading in that the healing actually takes place in 2 stages. It's as if the first healing is not adequate or doesn't work. And in a way, it's a great introduction to the next parts of this, the next stories we hear, which are about people hearing or seeing in succession. Chapter 8, verse 27 of Mark, and to the start of chapter 9, is a discussion with Peter, who doesn't understand the costs of being the Messiah, or a servant or a disciple of the Messiah. And starting with the first 13 verses of chapter 9, Peter, James and John witness the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain. They glimpse the Messiah in glory. They're waiting desperately and wanting to set up a camp and stay there. Jesus leads them back down the mountain and reminds them of the way that is his impending suffering and rejection. He leads them straight back into conflict with evil forces that keep people's eyes and ears closed. In 9:14 and on to verse 29, Jesus restores hearing and the power of speech to a tormented boy whom the disciples have been unable to heal. How can those who don't yet hear properly themselves open their ears to another? Jesus tells them that only prayer can overcome such a demon. Only prayer will help those who have ears and don't hear. Immediately, he speaks to them again about his coming death and resurrection. But again, it doesn't go past their outer ear. They don't understand and are not even game to ask for more explanation. In chapter 9 and verses 33 to 37, a passage we heard a couple of weeks ago, Jesus uses a child to teach them about who is the greatest, and that it would be better to be blind or physically disabled than to ignore or not see the consequences of abusive or destructive actions. Can't you see that? Chapter 10, verses 1 to 12, Jesus shows in his discussion about divorce that even though Moses allowed for divorce, a new framework that the disciples, of course, do not see, was that divorce, though legal, was harmful in society where marriage provided protection, both physically and economically, for the vulnerable, that is, women and children in families. After that, Jesus again emphasizes the same point about not turning children away. Don't you see? You have to look after them. Next comes the story of the pious rich man. Like Bono in U2, he still hasn't found what he's looking for. Here is a man, I won't sing it. Here is a man who has kept all the commandments. He comes to Jesus looking for an answer. It's one thing to be able to see the answer, though. It's another to have the courage to embrace it. This brings out a number of themes in Mark's Gospel. Are you ready to give up the whole world to find your life? Are you ready to give up aspirations of greatness, to embrace servanthood and childlikeness, to follow Jesus to the way of the cross? A rich man is not willing to let go. The cost is too high. The disciples can't comprehend Jesus' suggestion that it is hardest for the rich. Their eyes are not yet sufficiently open. In fact, the whole culture equates wealth with greatness and even greater holiness. At this point, starting in verse 35 of chapter 10, the sons of thunder, the brothers James and John, come asking a favour. Please note, Jesus asks them when they come up to him, "What can I do for you?" They ask if they can be the favoured ones in glory. Jesus says in his own words, "You don't know what you're asking." In other words, don't you see? You must drink my cup and be baptized as I have. He's just spoken to them in the previous section about his suffering and death, and still they don't see, read, understand, about the cost of following or the nature of servanthood. And all this leads us to the last bookend of this section of Mark's Gospel, the healing of the man, and the heading, in my new NIV, the story is known as Blind Bartimaeus. Let me read it to you as it's this week's set passage from Mark. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. Both Mark and Jesus did not call him blind Bartimaeus. He was a blind man, but Bartimaeus. Just as in English or Norse we originally would say John's son, or Fergus' son, or Donald's son, Scottish had MacDonald or MacTaggart, meaning the sons of Donald or the sons of Taggart. The Irish would denote lineage by O'Rourke or O'Brien, meaning out of Rourke or out of Brian's family. Bar in Hebrew means son of, or grain, meaning the word seed as well, or it can mean pure. And so it was with the son of Timaeus, sitting by the road begging. He was a person with a family. In fact, he is the only person with a name that Jesus heals. That leads me to ask, why, even in Mark's Gospel, was this person particularly named? Think about what possibilities there might be for that person his name being included. Jesus has taught us a lesson about inclusion, just as in the name and the acceptance of the person. He's not defined by disability, so let's not call him blind Bartimaeus anymore. This son of Timaeus calls out to the son of David. What's the significance here? He's recognized Jesus as belonging to the powerful King David's lineage. Then the disciples call him over to Jesus. Jesus asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Duh, Jesus, why would you even ask? As if you don't know what he would want." But this question is notably the same question that Jesus asked of the sons of thunder when they wanted to have the ultimate of importance. Jesus is teaching the disciples a lesson again about what discipleship really is. It means following, learning, copying, serving. Bartimaeus has no pretensions to power or wealth or glory or privileged position. All he is doing is trying to survive and dreaming of recovering his sight. He just sits by the roadside with his coat spread in front of him, begging for coins from the pilgrims on their way up to Jerusalem, which is where Jesus is inexorably travelling. He leaves his cloak, his only possession, behind and follows Jesus. Bartimaeus is rewarded for his faith, and he has another first in the Gospels. He is the only one Jesus heals who becomes a follower of Jesus. But his Son of David call is soon echoed by the excited crowd as Jesus enters Jerusalem. So we've reached the end of this bookmark, but we take note of the linkages to this story since the first bookmark about the previous healing about the blind man from Bethsaida. Bartimaeus sees, and he also sees what the disciples have failed to see. I recommend that you have a look at those 2.5 chapters that start in Mark chapter 8 with the words in verse 18. Do you have eyes but fail to hear, and ears? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? It would only take you 10 minutes to read to Mark 10:52, as I have, and find out a number of things that are not seen or heard. This marks the position of the second bookmark, and the rest of Mark's Gospel leads to the crucifixion. See? Mark is telling us, and the readers, which includes us, what it will take for us to follow Jesus on the way. As Ched Myers puts it in his commentary, only if the disciples, or readers in our case, struggle against the internal demons that render us deaf and mute, only if we renounce our thirst for power, in a word, only if we recognize our blindness and see true vision, then can the discipleship adventure carry on. And to keep you thinking about miracles and healing, I've included a song on the website about a blind man called "He Saw It All" by the Booth Brothers.